Stop! You can't fix your own car. Yeah, it doesn't matter to you if you're buying a new car and you clearly have warranty or maybe some sort of service plan for what, 3 years, 4 years? But most people nowadays can't afford to take a loan out every few years and buy a new car. So the whole idea of being able to fix your own car makes sense. I mean, I grew up fixing my wrench in my own cars, doing valve adjustments and changing brakes and doing oil services, even rebuilding transmissions. I've done a lot of that work and a lot of you have as well. But guess what? These greedy OEMs now are taking things to a whole new damn level. Like, they literally want you to grab your pant legs, bend over, look down, and see what you're missing. Guess right. That's right, your wallet just fell out of your pocket. Because what's happening now is these manufacturers want to take it to the consumer. And even more than we even thought. You thought things were getting bad. Keep buying new cars. Keep buying some of this new techie stuff. You're going to see. Because have you heard this story, Ionic? What is this? A 5N. Okay, Ionic 5N. EV. Everybody's like, oh, how cute. What a cute little Ionic. Well, you know what? There's an article I came across here recently where an owner of an Ionic 5N decided he was going to change his rear brakes. And he was doing so because they tend to chew up the brakes a little bit harder. And he had previously done a lot of this. This is a Reddit comment I had come across, and there's articles all over the net. But this has been going on for a while and progressively getting worse. And we'll talk about that because what we've been hearing now is you're no longer able to do a lot of your own servicing. There's a lot of lobbyists pushing to actually have the manufacturers take full control of your servicing. I mean, service plans are one thing, but the ability, once you're out of warranty and service plan's gone, you can't afford to buy a new car. What, you're going to get locked in to spend $3,000 or $4,000 to do a brake job? That's where it's trending. See, because this article shows this gentleman who bought himself a 5N or an N, Ionic N, whatever. And he came across a situation where his rear brakes were gone. He needed to change them, and like many other times in the past, he'd come across, you just go in there, take your wheel off, push the caliper back, really undo a couple bolts, take the caliper off, and of course, slide the pads out. But when you slide the pads out, you need to retract the pistons, right? Because the pistons push the pads, but they don't reset every time you brake. They constantly push the pressure in the system, pushes and holds the pads in the last position. So to get those brake calipers open again, you have to retract them. And most cars traditionally have, a pretty easy way to do it. I've seen Hondas where it's got a big slot and you got to put a big flat blade and you got to turn it in and then it spins it in. And other ones you just use like a C-clamp and you can tighten it up and you can open them up, or use a wrench and just kind of reef on it. And you can pull those pistons back so you can put your brake pads in there. Well, just so happens this gentleman who's used to doing a lot of brake jobs on his car came across this situation where he could no longer do that. Why? Well, because there's blocks on the system. Yeah, blocks. They have a software block, okay? And a lot of manufacturers are doing that these days. They're preventing you from doing a lot of your own service. Okay, well, you're just like, okay, I can do my own oil changes and filters, and yeah, for now. But the way things are going, they're creating more difficulty. I mean, when's the last time you tried to change an oil filter or an air filter on one of your cars? You're probably finding some of the newer model ICE engines now, sometimes you need a special Torx or a security bit to get it open. Sometimes the clips are in a very awkward position. Sometimes you've got to take a whole bunch of series of piping just to be able to take the intake box off. They're making the designs much more difficult. They're making it more complex. In some cases, you need a whole new series of tools. And this is just where we see the industry trending. Now with this 5N, it's EV, so you don't have air filters, engine oil filters. That's not really a thing, but you do have brakes and tires. Have you heard the latest? Obviously, with this 5N, and this guy that I came across on Reddit had said that he was no longer able to do that. He couldn't retract these pistons to change out his pads. Rather, there's an actual software block preventing him. Unfortunately, he doesn't have the software, he doesn't have the programmer, he doesn't have the equipment. You look at a lot of this equipment nowadays, you need specialized training, you need equipment that might cost $10,000 or $15,000, $20,000 to change, to use, plug in, and then you need to understand how to operate it. I mean, even a basic OBD2 code reader is getting pretty advanced these days for $30, let alone this $50,000 unit that talks up clutch pickup points and brake sensors and retracting brakes and ABS controls and all kinds of different tech that you could only dream of. It's a very technical vehicle these days that we're driving. Every vehicle, just about every car that you see on the road today is 100 times more technologically advanced than generation 10 years earlier. And while sometimes there's a need for it, sometimes there's safety, sometimes things like torque vectoring and ABS systems improve the reliability, improve the safety of a vehicle. But let's be honest, a lot of this technology is just extra cock block. They basically put it there in place to prevent you, the owner, of doing your own work. Yeah, we've heard about these talks. We've heard maybe California, I've heard in Australia, lots of discussions where they're trying to push and lobby that people like us, consumers, are no longer able to work on your own car. Now, when you're shopping for your new vehicle, nobody's really asking those questions. Nobody asking, even in this case, this Ioniq 5N, that buyer likely probably didn't ask all those questions. Nobody does. You look at it, you like it, you test drive it, yay! How much per month? You think budgets, all of those factors, and then you're just ready to sign on the dotted line. But what we're finding today is more and more car manufacturers creating software blocks. I mean, think about way back in 1993 when manufacturers came up with what they called the OBD2. You know, before that, I had a BMW way back before the OBD2 sensors. I had I think it was a 92, and it was just a year before that. And so it didn't have OBD2. Rather, it had this special little BMW thing, and you either plug it into this port, or you could turn on the ignition a certain way and hold down the throttle all the way and pump, and reset, and do a couple of keystrokes. And all of a sudden it would give you a series of flashing lights like a 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Or it would give you a series, and then you'd reference that, and then you'd understand that, okay, that's an oxygen sensor, or there's a misfire on cylinder 6. Whatever it is, it was pretty cryptic and it was complicated, and every car manufacturer had their own way of controlling their own diagnostics. But then OBD2 came out. There was a need and a demand for everybody, all mechanics, the industry, consumers, to be able to plug in and grab their diagnostic problems, download it, and understand what the issue was. Well, of course, time goes on and cars get more complicated, and cars, like a lot of the European vehicles, we find that they were doing that, but then they still hid a whole pile of other codes beyond that wall. See, there was a standard set of codes, but then they had their own unique codes for the brand. And there's more and more of that background noise has been going on. But guess what? Time's been going on and on and on, and we're seeing more and more of these situations where it's more hands-off. You know, on one hand, you have the OEM saying and the dealer saying, it's actually not safe. You shouldn't be changing your own brakes because that's the only thing slowing you down when you're doing 70 miles an hour on the highway. You need to have a professional change your brakes. But on the other hand, I've taken my car into a mechanic shop and recognized I only had a second-year apprentice working on it sloppily and made the car worse when I drove away. So it's not always get what you ask for. And let's be honest, sure, while a good mechanic is worth their weight in gold, the problem is you're not always getting that top-level service. You're sometimes getting haphazard, halfway service. And let's be honest, even if you're getting a good mechanic, not everybody has an extra $2,000. We've talked about what's going on in the cost of living, and most people, they actually say half of the population in the United States has less than $500 available to them ad hoc, should they need to repair. What if a set of brakes comes up that they need to replace? All of a sudden, the dealership says, no, that's going to cost you $2,500 for pads and rotors. Whereas back in the day, you could go down to a jobber shop, swap out your discs, put on some new pads, and you could be in and out, grab your own parts, do a quick flush, and you could probably have all those parts for $200 and do it yourself in an afternoon on the driveway. Well, guess what? Unfortunately, those days are done. And we're seeing more and more situations where if they're not blocking it, I mean, it's hard to block an oil service, but they created such complexity that it creates such a scenario where customers are just shy. They put all these belly pans. They create, cars are very difficult to access batteries. I saw a video the other day with a Dodge Journey, and the battery was tucked underneath behind their headlight, where you had to take a wheel off, take the inner liner out, and then you could barely access the terminal. It was a real pain. And what do you get? A lot of these OEMs are just screwing the customers. Why? Well, it's more money in their pocket. Let's be honest. Designed obsolescence is a real factor. So every time you go out there and buy that new car, don't think it's the same as the car 10 years earlier. You might go out there and think, oh, I'll buy a 2026 Toyota Camry when my 2015 Camry was bulletproof. Well, guess what? There's just so many new advancements, not just in technology, but a lot of the packaging now is becoming more complex and much more difficult for the consumer to do that work themselves. You want to do an oil change? You want to do filter changes? Access is more and more difficult. Sometimes just getting the information. I've seen guys buying McLarens and they can't get the information on a torque rating for a bolt. McLaren won't share that. Porsche won't share a lot of those numbers. It's very difficult to get facts, figures. What's the part numbers? What's the torque settings, the ratings? Where do you get these parts? A lot of those things are sort of kept closer to these dealers' chests. Why? It's a guaranteed mode of profit. That's right, the profit margins are there now for the dealers because, as we all recognize, how do you think they make their money? Dealers make money on the sale of a new car, absolutely. But as I've already expressed, they're only making anywhere from 2 to 8%, somewhere in that probably $2,000 to $6,000, $7,000, maybe on average $4,000 or $5,000 markup. And the rest, they're relying on extras, upgrades, options, add-ons, and of course, things like paint protection film, floor mats, service plans, loaners. They give you all this other nonsense and fluff, rim and tire protection, dent protection packages, most of which is trash and fluff, and you pay way more than it's worth. But also, it's just simply clearly not worth it. They're trying to sell you that. But the other area that they make their money is on parts and service. Now, let's be honest. There's been times where I couldn't find the right part at the independent shop. I'd go look at a Napa or go to Canadian Tire or one of those places, and I couldn't find a part. And I'd call them up. I say, I need this widget. It's a component, maybe a water pump for my BMW. And they'll tell me, oh, that's classified as an engine part, so we don't have that in stock. You're going to have to order that from the dealer. There's more and more of those scenarios where I'm finding that even the jobber and the aftermarket parts supplies are actually reducing the available parts of that you can get your hands on. So rather than you being able to go down and get that $50 jobber water pump, now instead, sorry, we don't have that. Check with the dealer. You call the dealer, I need the water pump for my car. They're going to tell you that's $682. And then you ask how much for labor. Well, it's another $480 labor plus shop supplies. Now you're at $1,300, $1,400 to do a water pump, when previous you could have done it for $50 or $100. See, that's where the profits are going. And they're not going into your pocket. They're going into the dealer's pockets. And it's all by design. Let's be honest, from my own personal take, there's no other reason you would put software blockers on systems that just meant that you had to open up a set of calipers. Why would you have to do that? Now, they're going to use the argument, well, you have to control very precise equipment. ABS systems are very precise in their safety, and the computer is very, they're going to say it's the computer is very sensitive, and you can't just do things like that. It'll mess up with the pot or potentiometer or resistance or capacitance in the electronics, and it'll potentially fry a circuit board. They'll give you all that nonsense and scare you away. But at the end of the day, even if that were the case, that's just more indication that they're creating all this extra complexity that just makes it more and more difficult for you to do your own work. It's almost at the point where you don't want to service anything. EVs already, we know it's pretty much hands-off. Tires on EVs are produced in certain ways. I didn't realize this until recently, that EV tires are generally built in a way that they have lower rolling resistance. But then if you want to put, say, one winter or snow tires on your EV, then that grossly impacts the mileage or the range that you'll get on your EV. So they'll spec them with a crappier tire that's a higher pressure and generally rolls with less resistance, but your safety isn't quite there. So if you want the safety margin for winter driving, then you go with something that's better grippy, but now it has more rolling resistance, and of course, down goes your range. These are all by design. But most importantly, the conversation here is when I see this customer and his Ioniq 5N or whatever you want to call that, I promise you I'm not buying one of those now after hearing this, and also after hearing how a customer a couple years back pierced the battery underneath hit a pipe or some kind of piece and was billed 50 grand for a set of batteries, I'm good, I'm out. See, because what we're seeing now is a whole new world of technology. It doesn't have to be that way, but it's going to be that way. Why? Because these manufacturers, on top of charging extra features like on your infotainment screens, now they're throwing on advertisements. Look at Jeep, Ram, Dodge. I mean, while you're sitting at the light, all of a sudden an advertisement comes up on your center screen. What is that? How about subscription services? There's another opportunity for them to milk the magic cow, right? They're down there milking away and you're looking down, what are you doing? So this is happening on the daily, and it's getting worse every single year. So every time you go down to the dealership, you think, hey, I'm going to buy a new car. Just think about this. Ask all those pointed questions. Servicing. Start looking into this. Google. Do the research. And understand the bare essential stuff. Yeah, you're not going to rebuild an engine. Nobody cares. But if you need a special piece of test equipment to get in there and unlock the software, I promise you, it's not just you. Your favorite backyard mechanic that's been working on your old Chevys all these years probably doesn't have that diagnostic equipment to do that either. And he might even push you away and say, sorry, I can't do that. I need this special software. So it's becoming more and more complex, thus driving up the price of ownership. Subscriptions, equipment you can't touch, belly pans you got to remove just to access anything. It's just becoming a nightmare for maintenance. And as such, what we're hearing are lobbyists pushing to have more and more control by the vendors, by the dealers, by the OEMs, to keep that work closer to them. But they're not selling it on that. They're selling it on the premise that you as a consumer don't have the skill and understanding and knowledge and wisdom to safely change a set of brakes or to change your oil because you don't know how to purge it, or you don't know how to add the oil, or you got to run it up and then add another quart and half quart. They're selling you, they're trying to create complexities that make you feel like it's a very daunting scenario. And let's be honest, this is not by accident. This is all by design. And it's becoming a scenario where car ownership is becoming vastly more expensive. So what do? Do you buy a new car and hope on a song and a dance that you don't have these problems? Or do you just backdate and buy something old? But then you risk higher mileage, rust, problems there, and obsolete parts. I've got my old 2003 Ram, and I promise you, I'm going to keep that old beast on the road as long as I can. But even that, I went down to the dealer and they had certain parts that they could no longer get access to. Block heater, plug it in the winter, they didn't even have that. It was discontinued. There's been some discontinued parts. The expansion tank for my coolant reservoir. There's been a variety of different discontinued parts in my old 2003 Ram. So if it's not a combination of hosing you and grabbing you by the curlies and charging you more than any of this is worth, then they're locking it with software, making it over complex, or just discontinuing parts so you have to buy that new version. See, if I get to a point where I can't replace parts because the vendors, the third parties doesn't have them, the dealer's not selling them anymore, and I can't replace a certain part of my truck, what do you do with it? I think you just scrap it at that point. But this is the unfortunate reality of the industry as a whole right now. The manufacturers are trying to take back control, trying to improve their profits in other ways now, saying that, well, they don't have the profit margin to sales, so they're now having to find these margins somewhere else. And unfortunately, you, me, we're bending it over and taking it like a champ. Anyway, I'd like to hear your thoughts down below. And again, as always, have a wonderful day, everybody. Cheers. Bye-bye.